Hey guys, welcome to Elite FTS. Andy Baker here. We're going to do a little intro to programming lecture to start things off. So when I talk to new coaches that are interested in program design for their clients, setting up programming for their gym, whatever the case may be, a lot of guys are very interested in the microcycle of the week, how to set up the sets and the reps and the exercises and the days of the week, exercise selection, volume, intensity, all that sort of thing. And obviously all that stuff's super important to get right. But I think one of the things that a lot of guys miss is to zoom out away from just the day-to-day and the week-to-week and look at the athlete that we're dealing with, and a really important concept, which is the rate of progression that this athlete is capable of or not capable of, whatever the case may be. As we know, a younger guy, a novice, somebody who's fairly new to lifting weights is going to be able to progress much faster than somebody that's been doing this for a long period of time. So a more advanced guy, an elite guy, somebody that's been training for many years or even several decades is going to be really difficult to come across PRs at any sort of regular interval. So you want to make sure that the rate of progression that you have set up for your lifter is appropriate, and that the rate of the progression matches the capabilities of the lifter. Because if you get a new guy and you're putting him on some super advanced complex thing, he's not going to be setting PRs as often as he's potentially capable of. So simple and fast is going to be more appropriate for the novice. And your more advanced guys, if you try to put them on something that's too simple and too fast, you're going to burn them out, potentially injure them. So the complexity and the slower speed for more advanced programming is by necessity, not necessarily because it's better. And typically if you write something down, like the way that we have our programming organized, so the way that we structure our programming here, basically it exists on a spectrum. Is at the novice level, we have very simple. Okay, so simplicity is up and speed is up. So simple and fast, okay? And then the further down the spectrum you go, it gets a little bit more complex and a little bit slower. So the problem is if you just lay out novice, intermediate, advanced, elite programming for the average coach or the average lifter, most of them are going to jump right to the advanced and the elite stuff, because they assume with that wording that advanced means better, and advanced doesn't necessarily mean better. It means a little slower and more complex, and that's because that's a necessity. It's not necessarily because you want that. So the novice, typically the way that we define novice is somebody that's going to be capable of progression within the week. So this is going to be somebody in their first few weeks, first few months of training. Usually with a novice progression, we're looking at between 6 weeks and 6 months of progression, being able to do this. So I look at it as progression within the week. So I'm just going to use one lift as an example. So we'll say Tuesday and Friday is our lower body day. We'll just use the squat to keep things simple. So we're going to squat, and we're going to use a medium amount of both volume and intensity. Okay, so something like 3 sets of 5 reps is kind of right in that middle ground of both volume and intensity. It's not real high either way. And on this, when we talk about progression within the week, is that basically we're going up between Tuesday and Friday, and then we're going up again between Friday and Tuesday. So let's just say this kid starts at 95, he'll be at 100, 105, 110. So it's a very fast progression. You're basically going up 5 pounds per workout, maybe 10 pounds per workout. But obviously this is not going to be able to work for a more advanced person. Somebody that's been training for even several months is not necessarily going to be capable of being able to go up twice per week, but the novice in his first few weeks or months of training can. And in my opinion, anything more complex and slower than that is just unnecessarily slowing the kid down. And this enables him to get a lot of practice, a lot of work with the competition lifts at nothing that's too high or too far on the volume or the intensity spectrum. The intermediate type of programming, basically what I'll do here is once this kind of starts to go stale, and again, it kind of depends on the lifter, again, anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months. The biggest influence on how long they're usually able to stay with something like that is weight gain. So if you start with a very small, scrawny, skinny kid, and he does what he's supposed to do in the kitchen, and he's able to push his body weight up, then this type of progression can last quite a long time. For somebody that's a little bit older, or somebody who's wanting to keep their weight, constant or down, then they're not going to have that sort of length to that novice linear progression. So we'll at the appropriate time, I'll switch them to an intermediate routine, which again is still pretty simple and it's still pretty fast. But basically the real change with this is instead of progressing within the week, now we're just progressing week to week. So again, it's still a very fast progression. And I'll also make some changes to the set and rep scheme. So instead of keeping both of these the same and kind of right in the middle ground, I'll often push the intensity up of one a little bit. So now instead of 3 sets of 5 here, it'll be anywhere from, I'll say 1 to 3 sets, and we'll just say of 1 to 3 reps. So this would be for a strength athlete, someone with their eye on potentially powerlifting or just pushing their strength levels up. Anywhere from 1 to 3 sets of 1 to 3 reps. So this is kind of your higher intensity day. And then to balance that out, we're gonna increase the volume but lower the intensity of this day. So this might be something like 5 sets of 5, but bringing that weight down a little bit. So if we were operating, if this was closer to say 85% of a 1 rep max for a newer lifter, this is going to be dropped down to probably 75, 80% for somebody at this level. So we've got our heavy, high intensity day, and then we've got our little bit lighter volume day. And both of these, see, they're not progressing within the week. Both of these are progressing week to week. So if we started somebody, let's just say this is 200 pounds, this is 150 pounds, it might look like 205, 210, 215, so on and so forth, 155, 160, 165. So it's still, as you can see, it's a pretty fast progression, but there's a little small amount of complexity introduced to the set and rep scheme, in that we're starting now to oscillate between higher intensity days and higher volume days. I'm going to skip down to elite real quick. Usually start with that. With elite programming, one of the things in the book that we did in practical programming was the section on elite programming was about that long. And basically because our thoughts on that was when you get somebody that's been training, say, a decade or more, and that's competed at a high level, that's reached some pretty high levels of strength. Basically at that level, everything's going to become so individualized and so auto-regulated that it's difficult to put something on paper that says, here, this is an elite program, because you're going to have all these different lifters and their programming is going to wind up looking very differently over time, because they've got, they've reached different levels, they've got different injury histories, and just, different biology is going to make them respond better or worse at different forms of programming. So there's going to be all this little individual stuff that makes elite programming difficult to put on paper. And so basically we just kind of put, individualized and auto-regulated. So, but you'll know when you're there. Advanced programming though, going back, is basically what I look at it is most people, and again, advanced always assumes better or a very high level competitor, and it doesn't necessarily mean that. Basically what it means is just somebody who's been training long enough and hard enough that they're no longer capable of progressing with these very simplistic types of programming methodologies. And so they're going to wind up on something where you're having to plan for PRs at a frequency somewhere greater than a week. And so like with my programming that I use, I'm asking for that lifter usually to display a performance increase or set a new PR on their squat, bench, deadlift about every 4 to 5 weeks. Okay. And so what that's going to look like, this takes a little bit of planning by the coach and by the lifter, but basically let's say this guy, his last PR was, let's just say 405. So he set a single at 405. Okay. So what I'll do with him is I will look at the upcoming block of training that we have, and I'm going to anticipate a small PR, let's say 415, and then I'm going to work backwards from there. Okay, so this would actually be in week 4, week 3, week 2, week 1. I'm going to have like 1 at 410, 405, 400. Okay. So it's something like that. Okay, this intervals may actually be too small for someone there. I may actually spread that out a little bit. But we're not looking at week to week going up 5 pounds. We're looking at every 4th week going up 5 or 10 pounds. Okay, so the next cycle, and then here I'll probably throw in a deload. here. On this next cycle, we're gonna say, okay, we ended this cycle, we set a PR at 415. On this next cycle, I wanna have this kid hit 425. Okay, that's gonna be our aim. So in week 4, I'm plotting 425, and then I'm working backwards from here, okay. Spread that out a little bit this time with 10-pound increments. And then we're just repeating that over and over and over again. And I've worked a lot of my advanced athletes. The details in terms of sets and reps and assistance exercises and supplemental exercises and all that is going to vary a lot by the lifter. And there's going to be other PRs within these little 4-week blocks of training. There's going to be volume-based PRs, there's going to be PRs on assistance work and supplemental exercises, but really on the competitive lifts, the squat, the bench, and the deadlift, I'm looking at asking them to display a performance increase about every 4 to 5 weeks. And so this works. You want to go with advanced programming, you want to go still with an eye on a progression as fast as you can, but you really have to look at sustainability. Okay, it has to be sustainable, because the one thing that will kill your rate of progression long-term is injury. And if you're trying to take a more advanced lifter and you're trying to push him too fast to too many PRs too often on the squat, the bench, and the deadlift, if you're trying to push that frequency too fast, you're gonna wind up with overtraining and injury. And that's the main thing that I want to avoid. So we're looking at speed, but we're also looking at sustainability and avoiding injury. So we're gonna talk a little bit about the Texas method, okay? Texas method is an intermediate level programming structure that we use for a lot of our lifters. And basically it can be a lot of different things in terms of the exact sets and reps and all that sort of thing. But basically what we're doing is we're splitting up the training stress of the competitive lifts by volume and by intensity. So we're gonna have a day devoted to volume-based training on each of the lifts, and a day dedicated to higher intensity training on each of the lifts. And so what that's gonna look like is where somebody may start with this is that basically you're gonna have let's just use, we use a full week. So we have a 3 and a 4 day Texas method. I'm gonna illustrate the 4 day Texas method. So some guys will start their week with volume and end it with intensity. Some will start with intensity and end with volume. It doesn't matter, because the days in between basically wind up to be the same. So you can try it both ways and then go with individual preference on that. I usually start with the intensity-based days. And so Monday, we would have an intensity-based bench. And by intensity-based, basically what we mean is a lower volume, higher weight day. So this is gonna be usually anywhere from 1 to 3 sets of 1 to 3 reps. Okay, so it could be as much as just working up to a top single in a lift, or it could be something like more intermediate in volume, like 3 sets of 3 at like 85 to 90%. So it kind of just depends. Don't get wrapped up in that. But the idea is that you're going to have an intensity base stressed here for, we'll say this is bench. And then Tuesday, same thing. We're going to have an intensity based squat session. And then Thursday, take Wednesday off. Thursday, we're gonna have our volume-based bench. And most people associate the Texas method, they think about the old 5 sets of 5, the 5x5 protocol, which is pretty good, and that's typically what we'll use. You don't have to, but it could be 4 sets of 5 or 5 sets of 4 or whatever else. If you feel like that's too much or too little, you could play with that a little bit, but 5 sets of 5 is a good starting place. And then we're gonna have squat volume here. Also maybe for 5 sets of 5. Okay, so we've got this structure in place, and at the beginning, we're basically just going to progress this on a weekly linear basis, okay? And what that's gonna look like, if these 5x5 start out here, let's just say we're at 250 pounds, then the next week is 255, then the next week is 260. Okay, so this is a weekly linear progression, very simple. You're just adding basically 5 pounds a week on your volume days, and then you're going to add, let's say 5 pounds a week on your intensity-based days. So if we're doing 3 sets of 3 here on the bench, and this is 250. Let's just say this is 275 or whatever. Then we go 280 the next week, 285 the week after that. So again, a weekly linear progression at both intensity and both volume. Then what's going to happen over time is that weekly progression is going to be somewhat unsustainable. You're going to have a hard time recovering. You're going to have a hard time actually putting the extra weight on the bar and making your sets and reps. And so we're going to start working things cyclically, okay? And so you can cycle, okay, either the intensity or the volume, or you can cycle both, okay? It doesn't really matter. I'll usually start with, it kind of depends on the lifter, but I'll look and see where they're at. If they're struggling really hard on one day versus the other day, then I'll introduce the cycling on the day that they're struggling with. If they're struggling on both days, then I'll start right away with cycling on both days. So it's kind of lifter dependent. In this example, I'm just going to show how to cycle both days, just so you can see what it looks like. But on the intensity day, it might look like 3 sets of 3 on week 1. Let's say that's at 300 pounds. And then on week 2, we go 3 sets of doubles at maybe 315. So we're going up about 5%. And then week 3, we're going to hit 3 singles at 330. And then we would start, so that's your 3-week intensity-based wave, and then we're going to start it over again. 3 sets of 3 times 305, 3 sets of 2 times 320, and 3 singles times 335, okay? And something like that can last for a really long time. People make progress and recover fine, so having that oscillation and stress seems to help with the progression and the recovery. And then you would do the same thing on your volume-based days. So if we wanted to cycle there, and I'll often wave the volume a little bit here too. So say 5 sets of 5. Let's say we were at 235. And then 5 sets of 4. So I may bring it down a little bit. 255. And 5 sets of 3 at, don't hold me to these numbers. I'm literally just pulling this stuff out of thin air. But it would vary, based on the person, obviously. So we have these these volume-based weeks, and we would do the same thing here. After the 3-week wave, we go back to 5 sets of 5, 240, 260, 270, and we're just doing that on the volume days, and we're doing that on the intensity days, okay? So, and over time, what might happen, and especially like on the squat, you may get to where doing, 3 sets, 3 intensity-based sets here, and then 5 volume-based sets here. Maybe that gets to be a little bit much for somebody, so you start dropping these down to where you're just doing one, you're working up to one all-out top set instead of multiple sets. So that, it may over time drop to where we're just going for like 3 RM, 2 RM, 1 RM, or you could spread it out, you could change it and go 5 RM, 3 RM, 1 RM. So you spread that out a little bit. So it doesn't matter. We're just setting up these different 3-week cycles on the intensity to kind of keep things fresh, keep things stale, and keep that intensity oscillating back and forth every week. And we're doing the same thing on the volume. And then what you see when you look at this on the Texas method is that the exercise selection is the same. Every week it's basically squat, bench, and deadlift. And the only thing that we're manipulating volume, intensity, sets, and reps on the same 3 lifts over and over and over again. This ties into when you look at the way a conjugate program is set up, it uses this exact same model. Okay, it's no different. It's just that instead of changing sets, reps, volumes and intensities all the time, we're changing the exercises and holding the volume and the intensity more constant. So with the Texas method programming, we've got the exercise selection staying the same, squat, bench, deadlift, and we're changing up each week the intensity that we do, the loads that we do, the sets and reps that we do. So that's where we're getting our variation from. Conjugate programming is basically the same model. It's just manipulating a different variable. So instead of holding the exercises the same, we're changing the exercises week to week, but more or less keeping the intensity, sets, and reps the same. So that's all it is a change in what variable we're manipulating, but the model is basically the same. So, okay. So instead of you know, a 3, a 2, and a 1, a 3, and 2, and a 1, it might look like bench, incline, close grip, floor press, overhead press, and let's say bench with bands. Okay, so this changes, but it's all basically the same in terms of volume and intensity. The reality is we may do it a little differently, but that's basically the way that that would work. These change, but this stays the same versus the exercises staying the same and the sets and reps changing. The thing with Conjugate, when everybody looks at, say, a Conjugate program versus a Texas method program or any other type of, you know, easy, simple programming structure where the exercises are the same week to week and you're just manipulating sets and reps, everybody looks at Conjugate and assumes that it's way more complicated, that this is way more complex than this. And I can tell you, as somebody who does both for a whole lot of people, that Conjugate, to me, is not any more complicated and in some ways is a lot easier to program than is the more basic stuff, because the more you repeat the same exercises over and over and over again, the more precise you have to get with your sets, reps, volume, and intensity. It's easier to overtrain on those lifts when you're doing them more often. Okay, so Conjugate, in a way, even though you're doing different exercises all the time, takes a little bit of the complexity out of it. Looking back at the Texas method again, we've got our 2 intensity-based training days, intensity-based bench, intensity-based squat on Monday and Tuesday, and then we've got our volume-based stimulus Thursday and Friday. So again, at the beginning of Texas method, with an early intermediate trainee, our volume work may be progressed just linearly. So again, we went over this, 5 sets of 5, maybe we're starting at 250, and he just is linearly adding 5 pounds per workout each week in a linear progression until that point, at some point in the future, this adding 5 pounds per week isn't going to work anymore on this volume-based stuff. And that's when I would switch the lifter to a cyclical approach, which is where instead of just going instead of holding the volume static and adding weight every week, I'd start cycling both the volume and the intensity on that volume-based stimulus. So we might have week 1 where we go 5 sets of 5, and that might be, I'm going to use a percentage-based 1RM here to reflect intensity. So it might be 5 sets of 5 at 75%, 5 sets of 4 on week 2, so let's see, week 1, week 2 at 80%, and 5 sets of 3 at 85%. Okay, so these are probably be a little high for, in terms of the volume and the intensity zones. These would be a little high for a more advanced lifter, but for an early intermediate lifter, this would probably still be a good place where they could operate in. It would be sometimes a little bit heavier for your newer lifters. And then as they advance, then these might get a little bit lighter in terms of, we might still do like 5x5, 5x4, 5x3, but you may have to bring down the intensity a little bit, especially as the other half of the week, the intensity-based stress over here is getting heavier, and more stressful. Then you want to be careful that your volume-based stimulus is also not too heavy, too grindy, too slow moving, because then recovery is going to become an issue. So over time, and again, I'm just going to use percentage of 1RM, it may look more like this. If we were going to use these same sets and reps, it may be between like 70, 75, and 80%. So that may have to come down a little bit for a more advanced lifter. And then you can see what this looks similar to. This looks very, very similar to what we would call the 3-week dynamic effort wave. And another way to think of the dynamic effort wave is just, it's a volume wave. That's what it is. It's your volume-based stimulus. It's just how it's done is typically done a little differently. So instead of being a little bit heavier for your conjugate type of split, is we can morph, you know, when we're working somebody with the Texas method, and a lot of these simple progressions are getting harder and harder to work with, and we want to move them into more of a conjugate style of training. It's very easy. This intensity-based stimulus over here just becomes your max effort days, and your Instead of changing just sets and reps, you're now changing exercise selection, and your intense or your volume-based stimulus, it's basically the same, although you may want to move, instead of doing, as many 5x5s or whatever, we'll look at, let's see, the same amount of work done a little bit differently, done more dynamically. This may be your 12 sets of 2, 10 sets of 2, 8 sets of 2, and the waves could be similar. It could be 70, 75, 80. Something like that would be very appropriate, for somebody making that transition from more of a Texas method-based volume type of day to a more conjugate or West Side type of day. But it's the same thing. It's just a volume-based stimulus. It's just now we're focusing more on accumulating that volume using the dynamic effort method. You use a little bit more speed, which it makes it a little bit more productive in my opinion. And it's also a little bit easier to recover from, I think. Especially balanced with the heavier max effort day on the other end of the week. So typically, a lot of what you'll read on the all the different literature on the conjugate method, West Side style training, that sort of thing, people talk about a 3-week wave, which can be lots of different things depending on where you're getting your material from. But what I typically think of a 3-week wave is, if we're using straight weight, we're looking at 75, 80, and 85% is a good, that's a very good range for a 3-week wave for somebody just using straight weight. If you're going to use band tension and that sort of thing, then you're going to want to lower, obviously, the amount of weight on the bar to where it might be something like 50, 55, 60, plus a good amount of band tension, which would still put you with the bar weight plus the amount of band tension, it's still actually going to put you at that range. But now we're using a combination of straight weight plus band tension versus just straight weight. The way I do my 5-week my wave, I actually use 5 weeks instead of 3. And the reason I went to that is because I really like this staying, keeping a lot of the work in that 75 to 85% range. But over a long period of time, as your lifters are getting stronger and they're hitting their dynamic work hard, they're hitting their max effort work hard, they're hitting their supplemental and assistance work hard, this starts to get pretty heavy, and starts to wear them out. And so you have to start looking at places to insert deload days. And so what I did, instead of having to wait for an athlete to report back that they're feeling like they're overtrained or whatever, then I just expanded the wave to include a couple of lighter weeks. And that also gives them the opportunity to work with some at the heavier end of the spectrum on their dynamic effort days, and at the lighter end of the spectrum, because people are always asking, should I go a little heavier to where I'm really having to fight to move that weight fast, or should I go lighter to where the bar speed is really, really fast? And to a certain extent, you can do it all. It all potentially works. But I feel like the real sweet spot is that 75 to 85% zone, but that there's still some value in working a little bit lighter, 60 to 70%. If for nothing else, it serves as a little bit of a built-in deload there to kind of pump the brakes on the intensity a little bit. And with doing that, I haven't had to insert those deload weeks in there. I can just keep the max effort weeks running. If somebody needs to pull back on a given day, then we do. But we haven't had to worry about that creeping overtraining kicking into where we got to pull back for a whole week or a couple of weeks in order to let that fatigue dissipate. Just by having those 60, 65, 70% weeks in there at a little bit lighter weight, I found that it's really helped my guys stay recovered, stay fresh, and set PRs more often. So my 5-week wave, I'm gonna shoehorn it in here. I've done 2 different ones, but the one that I keep going back to is usually week 1, 60%, 65%, week 2, and 80%. So this is the one I keep going back to. So these 2 here, a little bit lighter. For the squats, I'll usually use, I'm just gonna use the pattern that I use for squats. I usually do 5 sets of 5 on both of these, okay? And then on the 70% week, keep the volume about the same, but I drop the reps, and I'll usually do something like 8 sets of 3. And then on 75% week, it might be like 6 sets of 3, and then potentially like 6 to 8 sets of 2 here on the 80% week. So this works pretty good for squats. And again, I feel like the sweet spot here is your 70 to 80%. You're getting a lot of value from that. And then your 60, 65% weeks, if for nothing else, serve as a deload. Let the hips, the low back, the knees, all that kind of stuff rest. One of the things that I do is my 85% loading. I will often do that in the form of back off sets on the max effort day. Again, it depends on the lifter. I know a lot of guys that do conjugate don't like the idea of doing a lot of back off work on the max effort day because it runs the volume up too high. Again, it just depends on the lifter that you're working with. If you're working with somebody that's newer to this, that's lighter, maybe not as strong, not as advanced, doesn't have as many years under their belt, then you can get away with a little bit more volume, and those back off sets actually work pretty well on the max effort day. So I'll just back off whatever, if it's floor presses or box squats or whatever variation that we're doing that day. I may have them back off with like 3 sets of doubles. So it's not real high volume, but it might be like 3 sets of doubles at like 85%. So that gets a lot of work in that 70, 75, 80, 85% range when you factor in the back offsets on the max effort day.